Throughout the Second World War, there were many men and women who were locked up inside of terrible Nazi prisons. Some of these sites of incarceration were inside of occupied countries, and within the walls of these prisons there were thousands who were executed. Many went to the guillotine for defiance to the Third Reich and the Nazis, and others were hanged inside of execution chambers. Throughout the Nazis' time in power, there were thousands who were condemned for their actions in the resistance, and with this many prisons became very terrifying places. In this documentary, we look at a number of Nazi prisons and the executions that took place within the walls during and after World War II had come to an end. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
Plötzensee Prison was built in the 19th century and was named after the manor and lake nearby in Berlin. During the Weimar Republic before Hitler seized control in 1933, there were 36 executions that occurred there. All of these took place using beheading by axe, which was common during the medieval and Tudor period, and there were some German executioners that were considered skilled with an axe. This was usually a hand axe, but later Hitler saw this as even too brutal, and he had the law changed to use a Faulbeil, or the German guillotine. After the Nazis took control, the prison housed regular criminals, and those people who were considered political prisoners. Hitler quickly Nazified the prison system, and housed many people who were considered enemies of his politics, and communists all up and down Germany were being imprisoned. Plötzensee saw communists held there, and it was one of 11 selected execution sites established by Hitler's government and the Nazi Minister of Justice, Frank Gertner, within Germany. It had a full-time executioner whose job it was to take the lives of anyone who was sentenced to death. These dealt with a large amount of condemned individuals during the time period, and they had an increased workload. With the new laws that were being brought in and how oppressive German society became, more people rose up, and many of these were sentenced to death. Many of the condemned people of Plötzensee were executed by a stationary Faulbeil or a guillotine. Many prisons had these devices, which were based within their walls, but hangings were also carried out inside the execution chamber. During Hitler's time in power and the Nazi regime, officially on record, 2,891 people were executed by the Berlin State Court and the People's Court. Many of these were executed in Plötzensee, some by axe but the majority by guillotine. From 1937 those condemned individuals were beheaded using a guillotine, taken from Plötzensee Prison, which was installed in a work shed near to the prison's walls. The condemned victims would have to walk from their cells into the ground level building where the guillotine was found, and they were then faced by the device that would take their lives. In 1942 in the same building, a beam was placed, which worked as a gallows, where many people could be hanged at one time. Up to 8 victims at the same time could be hanged on this wooden beam, and what was even more shocking was that the condemned individuals' families had to pay for the privilege of their loved one's execution. Each day on death row, in a sense, cost 1.5 Reichmarks, and the execution charge was 300 Reichmarks. Around half of those who were executed at Plötzensee were sentenced to death as they were condemned for carrying out acts of resistance against the Nazis. Some who were condemned included the Red Orchestra. These were a group of anti-Nazi workers who printed anti-Nazi leaflets and propaganda, and distributed them to try to encourage people to rise up against them. It was said of some of their executions, when the day of execution was determined, the person convicted for a day or several days was placed in a special cell, a death cell. In the prisons of Plötzensee and Brandenburg, there were cells downstairs that had been turned into death cells. The very fact of being transferred to this cell let the convict know even before the official notification that his hour had come. On the 13th of May 1943, 13 members of the group were executed at Plötzensee. Other members of resistance groups such as the Kreisau Circle were executed there, and 677 prisoners from Czechoslovakia were guillotined or hanged. A number of these were members of the Czech resistance when the Germans occupied their lands, and over 200 death sentences were carried out against Polish members of resistance. 245 death sentences were also carried out against French citizens. Around 300 people who were executed there were women, and following their executions, the bodies of the condemned were then sent for dissection at the Humboldt University of Berlin. One man who was executed there was Berthold Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg. He was the older brother of Klaus von Stauffenberg, the man who planted the bomb inside of Hitler's Wolf's Lair. Following the failure of the July 20th plot, He was arrested and was questioned on his views about the final solution. He told the Gestapo that he and his brother had approved initially, but they considered the final solution to be too aggressive and excessive. He later stated, "The racial idea has been grossly betrayed in this war, in that the best German blood is being sacrificed, while simultaneously Germany is populated by millions of foreign workers, who certainly cannot be described as of high racial quality." However, as he was involved in the Stauffenberg plot, he along with 8 other conspirators was hanged inside of the prison. To prolong his death and make it more painful, von Stauffenberg was cut down a number of times from the beam after he was hanged. And then he was hanged yet again after being revived a number of times. This made him suffer longer. His execution was even filmed, and then Hitler watched this back at his leisure to see in his eyes that justice was administered against the people who tried to take his life. Another person to succumb to the execution chamber was Ilse Stoebel. She joined the Communist Party of Germany and was a member of the underground resistance. She was arrested by the Gestapo for allegedly spying for the Soviet Union in 1942. She was then tortured for 7 weeks, where she was forced to confess. She was then sentenced to death for treason and was executed on the 22nd of December 1942 and faced the guillotine, whilst an accomplice was hanged from a meat hook there. It was also a place where criminals and murderers were killed, as Paul Ugazov, the S-Bar murderer and serial killer who killed 8 women inside of Berlin between 1940 and 1941, was killed. He used the blackouts to kill his victims, and following his trial he was sentenced to death. He too faced the guillotine after being declared an enemy of the people. The youngest victim of the Nazi guillotine was executed at Plötzensee and was Helmut Hubener. He was the youngest person to be sentenced to death for resistance to the Nazis and was just 17 when he was killed. It was unusual for an underage defendant to be condemned, but the court stated he had displayed an adult level of intelligence in his crimes, and because of this he would be killed and punished as an adult. Appeals for clemency were ignored, and at 8:13 p.m. on the 27th of October, he was beheaded by the guillotine inside the execution room. Helmuth Hirsch was also executed there, and he was sentenced to death for his involvement inside of a bombing plot. It's believed his targets were a Nazi headquarters in Nuremberg, and also the plant where anti-Semitic Der Stürmer was printed, but he was arrested by the Gestapo. He was interrogated and transferred to Berlin's prison, and was charged with committing high treason, and he was indicted for possessing explosives with the intent to commit a crime. He was held in solitary confinement, and the newspapers claimed he was trying to assassinate Hitler. There were calls for clemency, however he was condemned to death, and was executed by the guillotine at 6 a.m. on the 4th of June 1937. In the evening of the 3rd of September 1943, an RAF raid damaged the guillotine beyond repair, and parts of Plötzensee were damaged. But because of this, the Reich Ministry of Justice ordered the immediate execution of the condemned people at the prison. Because of this, around 250 people were waiting in rows of 8, where they were hanged on the beam inside the execution cell. The Plötzensee Bloody Knights from the 7th to the 12th of September 1943 executed them, and the killings continued until the 20th of April 1945. But inside of Plötzensee, during Hitler's time in power, around 3,000 inmates and prisoners were executed. It became a large execution site, and a place which was incredibly feared. Many of the executions were carried out swiftly and quickly, but others were carried out to prolong the suffering of a victim.
Landsberg Prison was built at the beginning of the 20th century, and construction took 3 years between 1905 and 1908. To begin with, it was planned that the site would hold around 500 inmates, and then at the end of the First World War, it was used as a place for fortress imprisonment. This was said to have been a comfortable form of imprisonment of prisoners who were privileged and wealthy, and there were many inmates who had easy lifestyles inside of the site. This later, as mentioned, included Adolf Hitler, who was allowed many visitors when he had been sent there for treason, and it was a place where many political prisoners would be locked behind bars. When Hitler seized control, it became a place which was a Nazi fortress, and it was where many people were sent to before they were sent on to concentration camps or other sites of incarceration. For example, in 1942, there were 4 policemen sentenced in the Guernsey police trials who were sent to Landsberg before they were sent on to concentration camps. But the prison was where a number of evil Nazi doctors conducted strange operations and experiments upon the inmates. For example, in 1943, there was a prisoner named Alfred Baker who claimed about his treatment that, firstly, I am scarred for life, left lower jaw, owing to the fact that I was run down, lost weight to 52 kilos, and they had to operate on me. That was at Landsberg, Lech, Germany, at the foot of some mountains. The doctor said to me, "I can't give you more food, as you are my enemy." The day after the operation, I had to go straight to work, forced labour. I also had abscesses in my ear a little time after the operation. On entering Buchenwald horror camp, I was kicked to hell by a big Nazi. Landsberg's conditions during the Second World War were rather varied depending on the prisoner, and some inmates lived and had little problems, but others had to conduct more stricter work, doing jobs such as peeling potatoes in the kitchen, but they would be overseen by a number of guards whose brutality varied. However, as the Second World War continued, the conditions and harshness of Landsberg Prison got worse, as it's said that at least 210 people died there due to either being starved to death or being executed by the Nazi authorities. But Landsberg became even more infamous at the end of the Second World War, as it was a place of imprisonment for Nazi war criminals and those awaiting trial or even execution. It was designated as War Criminal Prison No. 1 by the US Army to hold convicted Nazis, and it was guarded by men of the US Army's military police. There were many former Nazis, concentration camp guards, and members of the SS who were hunted at the end of the Second World War. They were advised by senior Nazis, or the SS, to try and hide out under false identities and papers, but many were captured and during denazification processes were actually uncovered as to their true identity and the crimes they had committed. Those who were arrested varied in their role in the Second World War, from those men of the Einsatzgruppe who had physically executed hundreds of thousands inside of Nazi-occupied lands, or even cooks inside of the concentration camps who were accused of slaughtering inmates who were accused of then stealing food. Some of those arrested were even capos, prisoner functionaries who were given jobs and roles inside of the camps by the SS. Landsberg between 1945 and 1946 held 110 prisoners who were convicted at the Nuremberg trials, and hundreds more were held following the Dachau trials, which dealt with prison staff who worked specifically at Dachau. It even held prisoners imprisoned following the Shanghai trials, but it was a place where almost 300 war criminals were executed in around 5.5 years. There were various execution methods used at Landsberg, but the most popular was the gallows and hanging, in which 259 death sentences were carried out in this way. But for those who had been allowed to have a more military-style execution, the firing squad inside the prison claimed the lives of 29. After the trials took place, executions would be carried out sometime later, sometimes even years, and at times there were so many who had been condemned that the executions had to be carried out en masse over consecutive days. This was due to the time being given when the condemned went through the trapdoor before they were pronounced dead. It took 4 days, for example, for SS guards from Dachau concentration camp to be executed consecutively on the gallows. But the executions usually took the same pattern and form using the gallows. The condemned would be kept inside of their prison cell and would have a normal prison life alongside the other criminals until the date of their execution. They usually submitted pleas for clemency too, and they were kept under close watch, and many, including even some female prisoners, shared cells with each other for companionship. They would then be alerted that it was time for their execution. They would be accompanied by many American military policemen and also a priest who remained with them until the final moments. It was the priest's job to offer spiritual guidance in their final moments, and many of the condemned had spent many months and even years knowing the prison chaplain. The priest usually administered also final masses and blessings, and also heard the final words of the condemned. Inside of the courtyard of Landsberg Prison were 2 gallows, which could be used simultaneously to quicken the process of executions up, if there were many people being put to death that day. This meant that 2 people could be hanged at once, then the work of the executioner was swifter. The guards of Landsberg also witnessed the proceedings. They would check the identity of the prisoner at the bottom of the scaffold before they made their way up onto it, where the executioner was waiting. On the scaffold, after being helped up the steps, the executioner checked that their arms and legs were secured. They were then placed over the trapdoor. It was usually at this point where a photographer would take a final photo, with the condemned stood over the trapdoor, being held by 2 military policemen, or the executioner with the noose pulled to the side. Following this, the executioner put a black hood over the head of the condemned, then released a lever, which opened the trapdoor. Then the condemned plunged through the trapdoor. Their bodies were then placed into a coffin after being cut down, and the chance to claim their remains was given to the families. Those who were not claimed were interred inside of a cemetery next to the chapel. It was here where court-martials of American soldiers were also carried out, and also where regular criminals were executed. And one example of this was a murderer and former concentration camp prisoner, Piotr Kemi, who was executed for murdering a German couple and their daughter. But there were a lot of high-ranking members of the SS who were executed at Landsberg, and it was a site which functioned similarly to how the British ran Hamlin Prison, where the main executioner there was Albert Pierpoint. It's believed that infamous US executioner John C. Woods may have carried out a number of botched executions at Landsberg, which did not go well. But some well-known prisoners held at Landsberg include Hitler's former escort doctor Karl Brandt, who was condemned for being involved in the Action T4 programme that led to the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of innocent people. He was also executed on the gallows there, as was Oswald Perl, the leader of the SS Main Economic Administrative Office. Another man who ran a concentration camp was Hermann Pister, who was the commandant of Buchenwald, who was also executed at Landsberg, and other prisoners include the infamous war criminal Joachim Peiper, who somehow managed to escape the hangman's noose for his crimes. The last executions that occurred at Landsberg Prison took place on the 7th of June 1951, and then many of the inmates were released. In May 1958, the Americans handed over control of Landsberg back to the Germans, and the final 4 prisoners were released, and these were men who had been convicted during the Einsatzgruppe trial. Landsberg Prison today is still a site of incarceration, and it is a facility that allows prisoners a chance to reform themselves and learn new skills and trades. Around 300 Nazi war criminals were executed inside of Landsberg Prison in the years after the Second World War, either on the gallows or on the firing range. Many of these men were the most evil war criminals of the Nazi regime. They had been responsible for the slaughter and suffering of thousands of people. Adolf Hitler, before the war began, targeted Czechoslovakia as a place for occupation and invasion. He was given a region of the land, known as the Sudetenland, following the Munich Agreement, to appease a Nazi dictator, but he wanted more. Inside of the country were many German-speaking people, and the Nazis wanted to unite all German-speaking people under the Third Reich. On the 15th of March 1939, German soldiers marched into this region, and they took over Bohemia and established a protectorate over the nation. The invasion showed Hitler's true intentions, but the occupation allowed the Germans to remove the threat of the large Czech army, take a huge chunk of the armaments industry for the German war effort, and also seize many Czech airfields. But the nation then underwent a ruthless and brutal occupation, and Hitler wanted the Czech people to work hard and to produce a huge amount of supplies for his war effort. One man brought in as the Reich protector was Reinhard Heydrich, who later became known as the Butcher of Prague. He was a serious SS officer and was very close friends with Heinrich Himmler, and Heydrich's job was to instigate a reign of terror to keep the land under submission and to prevent resistance and problems arising inside of the country. He was the man directly responsible for the Einsatzgruppe, who caused chaos, slaughtering millions of people following advancements by the Wehrmacht during the war, and this showed you the true evil of Heydrich. He proclaimed martial law, and within 5 days of him arriving in Prague, 142 people had been executed, some of these in public. There were also 5,000 people arrested, and hundreds more were executed inside the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Many thousands of people were sent to concentration camps, and Heydrich's brutal policies served to stop resistance and to keep people falling into line, to keep the land productive for the Third Reich. Heydrich foresaw that one day he believed the Czech people would be completely wiped out, and that the land would be filled with Germans, but as was normal during occupations, the Germans seized control of much of the infrastructure, including the prisons, and they then put them to use for themselves. Pankrác prison was a site that opened in Prague in 1889, and it was regarded as the Imperial Royal Prison for men in Prague, and inside the facility were a number of bathrooms, classrooms, which prisoners were ordered to learn inside of, as well as a gymnasium, lecture theatre, workshops, chapels, and also an execution chamber. The prison in 1926 was given approval to carry out death sentences inside of it by hanging, and the first execution of Pankrác took place on the 6th of December 1930, when a murderer was condemned. There were only ever 5 executions there between the first execution and the German occupation, but when the Nazis seized control of the site, the horror ramped up. Pankrác prison had a Gestapo unit set up inside of it, and it was where thousands of Czech people were locked up inside of, and this included suspected members of the resistance and those who were accused of being involved in the black market. Many prisoners were held before the Nazis then sent them to go and be executed at other sites such as the Kobylisy shooting range nearby. One former inmate of the prison wrote of the site that there were an extraordinary mixture of prisoners consisting of soldiers, airmen and civilians of almost every nationality, for the guards continually came to inspect us. Whenever they appeared, we all had to spring to attention facing the wall. As they passed us, we shouted out our numbers, at the same time keeping our hands above our heads until permission was given to lower them. This former prisoner of the site was only there for one night, and he wrote a terrifying description of Pankrác, and the prison had a deep impact on him. He wrote, "The cell was perhaps 8 feet long and 5 feet or 6 feet wide. At the entrance was a toilet bowl that also provided the only available drinking water. Hanging directly off one wall, there were 2 very narrow bunks stacked vertically. There was a tiny table and a single chair in the cell, and up high on the wall was a very small window. Because it was 12 feet off the ground, inmates could not see out of it. The cell was generally bitterly cold or stiflingly hot. Pankrác prison was tremendously overcrowded, and inmates were given very little food. Every morning after coffee, rain or shine, there were outdoor exercises. Often the guards beat inmates during these exercises and subsequent roll call. The Nazis filled the prison and made more space, and 2,200 people were held there, and it was the biggest site of incarceration in the Czech lands. But the Nazis in 1943 began to carry out huge scores of executions inside the prison. There had been 3 execution chambers of cells, which had been designed to carry out the executions of prisoners. Previously, as mentioned, inmates were condemned at other sites, but Pankrác then became the place where 1,079 people between April 1943 and the end of the war were executed by a specific device, the guillotine. This was a metal device known as a Fallbeil in German, the falling axe, and this execution device was ruthless. Skilled executioners could take someone's head off in seconds, from when they entered the chamber until their deaths. Prisoners would be quickly secured on a board before they were slid under the blade, and this was then released. Their heads were then collected inside of a metal basket. This guillotine made the prison very dark in its reputation, and there were also scores of inmates who were hanged. The executioner who worked here was Alois Weiss, who performed much of the deaths and executions. His specific executions followed the same procedure. One of his assistants held the hands of the condemned to stop them moving when the guillotine blade was released, and the second assistant stood at the feet of the prisoner and untied the hands following the blade falling and the head being taken off. The 2 assistants then pulled the body to a box to the right of the guillotine, and then took the head out of the basket and placed this next to the body. Weiss, the man who released the blade inside of Pankrác, would then write the name of his victim in his execution book, and usually his executions took roughly 3 minutes. At the end of the Second World War, a number of Nazi officials and collaborators were executed inside of the prison. This included the senior chief of the order police, Kurt de Luger, and also Karl Hermann Frank, who were executed in the courtyard of the prison, and also de Luger was in front of a huge crowd of 5,000 people. These were executed using pole hanging, a method which was used prominently within Czech lands. There were many more executions of Nazis in the courtyard of the prison, but this was later changed and the executions remained at this site. The death chamber following this was a simple noose attached to a wall, and there was a remotely operated trapdoor in the floor. At the end of the war following the communist coup of 1948, Pankrác remained a place of execution where roughly 230 prisoners were executed for political dissent, including the female anti-communist activist Milada Horáková. It was the only place where capital punishment could be carried out until the last hanging occurred in the prison in 1989. The exact number of prisoners and victims of Pankrác prison during the Second World War is unknown, but it's certainly a figure in the thousands. There were over 1,000 people who were executed on the guillotine, but there was also a large number who were hanged inside the different chambers in the Gestapo-controlled prison. Pankrác became notorious for the fact it housed those who were suspected of being involved in resistance or in defying the German occupation. Some of the most ruthless execution methods were deployed inside of the prison, and executioners from Germany were brought to take the lives of many people. The conditions of the site were also very tough, and many of the guards were known for their brutality, and today it is still a prison, and many people find themselves locked up there. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.